Hello, and thank you for joining another episode of the Muddy Waters podcast and YouTube series. My name is Philip Macko. I'm a five-time published author. Proud to say my first novel reached number 3 on the Amazon top-selling list at one point. But I'm an avid researcher. And listen, the goal of the Muddy Waters podcast and video series on YouTube is to call out the scams, to identify misinformation, and really to help you, the viewer, the listener, make an informed decision based on fact. Listen, we're not opinion hosts here. We're not going to bias ourselves or try to bias you towards any opinion. But there's so much misinformation going on that we found there's value in really just presenting the facts. The hope is that if any of you find yourself trapped in these echo chambers where it's, confirmation bias, it's continuing to feed that cycle of things that you believe that may or may not be true, at least to encourage you to step outside of that and triangulate a little bit that information. You may find in your research that perhaps some of the information you base decisions on can be challenged in that exercise, and that again is really the hope to get you thinking. So I want to talk about Ukraine with you today, and let me first say that I'm going to present some facts around Ukraine, none of which are meant to take away from the sheer horror of war, the tragedy that's occurring. Next to World War II, this is the deadliest battle in the European continent. And I don't mean to take away from the suffering, the damage, the life-altering situation that's occurring in Ukraine. So please take that disclaimer. But let's talk about first the strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia. Now, realizing that Russia has been on the march attempting to take back territories it believes belongs to it. You all might remember back around 2014, a little bit later, that Russia invaded Crimea, which was the lower portion and annexed to Ukraine. They claim to be doing so because of dissidents in Crimea, but that was clearly not the case. The Donbass region of Crimea contains a port that's called Sevastopol. And what's important to note about Sevastopol is it is the only warm water port that Russia has access to. So if you think about military expansion or strategic military targets, having a warm means that you can resupply equipment, food, artillery, munitions, troops, all those types of things, where when the water freezes over, that of course becomes a challenge. But then if you were to look at a map and look at Sevastopol, it is strategically located in a way that gives Russia the ability to respond quickly to potential conflicts in Syria, potential conflicts in Iran, both of which they're aligned with. And should, let's say, the US find itself in a conflict with either of those countries, having that port established, which is why they took Crimea, gives them that immediate access. Whereas if they lose access to that port, it's a very circuitous route for them to respond. So, again, while Russia announced that, this was political dissidents and whatever misinformation they spread, it was a very strategic decision on their part. From an economic perspective, and you can look at what's happening in Russia economically, they're not quite the superpower that they were once before. Ukraine being within 200 miles of Russia, number one, if they were to become a NATO ally, then NATO has a front 200 miles away from Russia, which is a threat. But then if you look economically at the potentials for Ukraine, take Poland as an example. When the Warsaw Pact was signed, Poland had a gross domestic product, GDP, of $65.9 billion. Since joining NATO, that has blown up to $679.4 billion. So more than a 10x factor. That's a threat. So the fact that Ukraine could become a NATO country, US forces could be within 200 miles of the Russian border to react to anything that might occur is a threat, not to mention the expansion if Ukraine does not join NATO, the expansion of Russian forces beyond, whether they accidentally or purposely attack a NATO country, our forces are further away than they necessarily would be. So think about it from a strategic perspective. Now let's get to the heart of things. The biggest objection has been the money, right? Why are we sending all this aid over to Ukraine when we have such a crisis at our US border? And look, I'm not going to discount the fact that the border has been an ongoing issue for so many different presidents and administrations, and it continues to be that today. And certainly there are things we can and should be doing. With your permission, I'd like to set aside the US border part of this conversation and think globally and financially about the implications of Ukraine. So to date, as of mid to late March, $75 billion has been appropriated in support of Ukraine. 1.6 billion has gone to humanitarian aid. So think supplies, water, those types of things, right? 26.4 billion has gone to financial aid. But here's what many people don't know, and I was surprised by this when I did my research. 62% of that $75 billion is coming to the United States. We have been sending weapons to Ukraine that have been part of our stockpile, and that 62% of that 75 billion has gone to replenish our military stock, adding jobs, adding money to local economies. You know, security, weapons, equipment, infantry arms, tanks, aircraft, all of those things combined have gone back to the United States economy. To give you a point of reference, the European Union has contributed $90 billion to Ukraine. We've contributed $75 billion. But here's the impact in the United States. In Lima, Ohio, as an example, is where Abram tanks and Stryker combat vehicles are being built, and now they're being rebuilt and restocked. There are actually 117 production lines in the United States across 31 states and 71 American cities where this money is funneling back to. The Pentagon launched a $624.6 million Stinger missile program in Tucson, Arizona, as an example. So it's important to realize that much of this money being earmarked to Ukraine is actually coming back to the United States, more than half, 62%. So keep that in mind in the equation as well. On a bigger scale, let's talk about the financial impact, right? So first of all, NATO Article 5 says that any NATO member, when attacked, all members must respond. So we're bound by this agreement. Should Russia accidentally or on purpose send a drone or a missile into Poland or some other place, we're bound to be a part of the response to that incursion. World War II, and keeping in mind that this could escalate to become World War III, it has that potential, right? If we adjust for inflation, World War II cost the US economy a little bit over $4 trillion. World War III would cause us to incur debt approximately 200 times our current gross domestic product. So to give you an example, our current GDP is $23.3 trillion, not billion, trillion with a T. This would increase U.S. debt by $46.6 trillion. So think about that for a moment, right? Um, we have spent $75 billion. That's a fraction of $46.6 trillion escalation in this campaign could cause, right? Um, then let's talk about the cost to human life. Um, there were 419,000 U.S. deaths in World War II, 37,700 wounded, 68.2 thousand came away with unknown or undefined injuries. So combined together, psychological, physical, deaths incurred, total of 671,000 people were impacted. And not just those people, but their families in World War II. We are taking proactive measures to try to limit Russia's advances beyond Ukraine. So we're trying to help Ukraine fight this incursion. But the idea for Russia, we believe, is not to stop in Ukraine, but to continue to expand. And should they do so, we'll find ourselves drawn into, and whether you agree with it or not, NATO, we'll find ourselves drawn into that incursion. And for all the reasons and more that I laid out for you, I think it's just important to really identify these facts, weigh them into the equation. And look, if you do and you still don't believe that we should be supporting Ukraine and sending money, I respect that because you have an informed decision based on facts. And that's, again, really the goal of this YouTube series and podcast episode. So listen, if you got something from this, please share with your friends. Please like and subscribe. Um, each week, maybe several times a week, we'll be presenting information. We'll have an episode upcoming on a prevalent AI scam that is important to know about. But listen, leave your comments in the comments section. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover into the future, let us know. And I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you have an excellent day.